Hey everybody, Joanna here. Today I'm going to be talking about what I read and did while on vacation. So, if you didn't know, I've been away from BookTube for the last couple of weeks. I was in Australia and Singapore with my husband. And if I sound a little rough, it's because I got sick and lost my voice while there, which I'll get to. But I just thought this would be a fun way to recap where I've been, what I've been up to, and talk about what I've been reading. And so, starting out the journey to get from Georgia, where I live, to Australia was quite intense because we had to take a flight from Atlanta Airport to New York to JFK and then take a flight there at 2 a.m. to Hong Kong. And so it was a very long flight getting there. And when we got to Hong Kong Airport, we got there early in the morning at that time. And it was awesome because we had access to this amazing lounge where we got to take showers and we didn't have to wait in line to take a shower. It was a really nice shower. And then there was even an area where you could get juice and tea, coffee, lots of different types of breakfast options. And there was even a sanctuary where you could do yoga and meditate. So we felt so refreshed after that experience in the Hong Kong airport before making our way to Australia, where we stopped in Melbourne and then switched planes to go to Cairns. And on the way there, I listened to the audiobook of An Autumn War, which is book 3 in the Long Price Quartet by Daniel Abraham. And the reason I listened to this exclusively on audio was because there was no way I was going to lug this around with me across the world. This story was harrowing and tragic. The magic that is set up in this particular world, in this story, the Ondat, which are these thought form creatures, are utilized to bring all the stakes to a fever pitch with this culminating war that's happening. And there are some incredibly devastating events that occur. It is a very character-driven story, so you get a lot of quiet character moments at the same time as these huge, epic, grand-scale things are happening. And I am continually impressed with the way that Abraham writes characters, the way he writes characters who are very well seasoned, because you do have 15-year gaps between each of the stories, and characters who are very young. He has an incredible gift for making these characters come to life, and they're very fallible. And I really enjoyed where things left off. As heartbreaking as they were, there were still remnants of hope leading into the last story, which I look forward to getting to. But this was a very enjoyable read overall. And I'll say that I enjoyed the audiobook experience of this story. I can see how some people might not as much because the narrator does choose to use voices that seem a little cartoonish at times. But for me, that didn't bother me at all. I felt like it still matched the tone and what was happening in the story. But I could see how that could clash if you had a different type of concept of the characters or different concept of the tone with this particular quartet. But it was very enjoyable. Cairns was very lovely. We stayed at a really nice hotel that had a lot of surrounding shops and restaurants, and there was a beautiful view of the ocean there. And we spent a day going to this village called Karunda. And so Karunda, it's in the rainforest there. There's a lot of surrounding rainforest in that area. And you take this lift to get out there, and it was so beautiful because you see this gorgeous rainforest underneath you, and even stop along the way to look more closely at the trees and plants there before going to Karunda, which is a tourist town with lots of shops and restaurants. It was a lot of fun. And the biggest highlight for me of that trip was the train ride back to Cairns, because where I was seated on the train towards the front, I had this view where I got to spot a kangaroo hopping across the tracks well ahead of the train and into the forest. It happened so quickly that I didn't get a chance to even let my husband know. But I was so excited to see a kangaroo out in the wild. And then other than that, in Cairns, we got to go see the Great Barrier Reef. So we went with a tour that takes you on a boat out to a site where you get to go snorkeling. And we had a fantastic time seeing the coral formations. They were absolutely gorgeous, otherworldly, ethereal, so many different colors and shapes. And then we went on this exclusive tour that we paid for that takes you further out into the middle of the ocean with a tour guide and a small group of people. And it was really wild doing that because you look around you and there is no land in sight. You're just there in the middle of the ocean with these people. And sure enough, the coral formations were even more spectacular out there. But unfortunately, that was when my husband started not feeling well. He started to feel very cold and nauseous. And so we opted to leave that tour early because of his health. And it was very strange. It was a very unusual set of symptoms for him, especially because he tends to be warmer than I am and very comfortable in the water. But he was really struggling and he couldn't get warm. Even after we got dry and got into our hotel, he still felt cold inside. He still felt shivery. And so we were worried that he had mild hypothermia, and it turned out to be the flu. So he was out for a full day the next day when we were going to go on a hike. The next day, we traveled from Cairns to Sydney. And I guess this is an opportunity for me to talk about the next read, which is Blood Over Bright Haven by Emma Wang. So this is the author of The Sword of Kaigen, and as soon as I saw that she had a new standalone released, I immediately jumped on it. And this follows a girl named Siona. Siona was an orphan at the age of 4, and she's now a young adult in the story. And she has 2 main goals in life. And one is to be one of the elite high mages of the city of Tehran, which is this utopian, industrial utopia that is generated on power of magic. And so she wants to be one of the mages that's in charge of the power of the city. And her second goal in life is to leave her legacy. So she's a character with a lot of goals, a lot of ambition and gumption. And she ends up being treated very poorly because guess what? This is a society that does not look favorably upon women, especially women who are trying to be mages. And she's jokingly or mockingly assigned a janitor to be her research assistant. And this janitor is a clansman named Tomil. He comes from the surrounding land outside of Tehran. Tehran is guarded by a barrier to protect it from what's called a blight. This blight is this fiery destructive force which is incinerating everything in its path. And so it ends up incinerating all of the lands surrounding Tehran where the clans people live. It kills off their livestock, it kills off their lands, their people. It makes them resort to cannibalism. And in order to survive, many of them try to cross over the barrier into the city of Tehran. And Tomil turns out to be one of the few who survives and makes it into Tehran, where he is treated horribly because guess what? The city of Tehran also doesn't look favorably upon indigenous people. It sees them as inferior. It treats them as laborers. So these poor indigenous people are being displaced and exploited in this story. And that tends to be one of the big themes in the story. So it's a very sick society. And a lot of the focus here is on the relationship between Tomil and Siona, who both come from an oppressed place in society, but from different places of privilege, as Siona is still more privileged, even as a female, than Tomil is as an indigenous person in the city. Some of the themes in this story have to do with legacy, of what we're leaving behind, altruism, finding hope in hopeless circumstances, but also this conversation about good intentions and whether good intentions outweigh the destructive consequences of what you attempt to do. And then there's also obviously patriarchy. And one of the strengths of the story is the way it shows people in power in this city and the way that they cling to their dogmatic religious beliefs in the face of very obvious cognitive dissonance that is blinding them from seeing truth and making them want to look towards what's convenient for them to believe in, and using straw man arguments against our characters like, oh, well, you just believe that because you're a female, you're of the weaker sex, so you would feel that way. So it's very frustrating to see how these characters justify things with their religion and do so, I think, in what's a believable way in the society, which is very sick. And then also the conversations from people from 2 oppressed backgrounds, as I mentioned. I think that was very detailed. The characters are very distinct. But where this story fell short for me was the lack of atmosphere, because I thought this idea of this industrial utopian society was really interesting, but I just felt like there wasn't enough description. It was just too minimal for me to feel immersed in the setting. I didn't feel like I got enough atmosphere. And while the dialogue did highlight the differences of perspectives in the story, I felt like the dialogue was so modern that I felt like it lacked nuance in showing the distinctions between people from different societies. I felt like it could have been much more detailed in that regard, but of course, everything I was wanting in this story would have added more complexity and probably would have made it so it was very difficult to succeed as a standalone, maybe. And I also felt like a lot of the plot points were very predictable for me personally until the end, maybe. And I thought the end did wrap things up in a satisfying way. But overall, I still think, even though this was a bit of a miss for me personally, I still think that the story succeeds in doing what it attempts to do, which is to illustrate these different perspectives, as I mentioned, and to demonstrate this very sick society and talk about legacy and future generations. And there is no stone left unturned as far as like explaining the magic, explaining the themes. But if you enjoy that, then it could be a very entertaining read, I'd say. So that was my experience with Blood Over Bright Haven. And going on from there to Sydney. Sydney was so special because we had this beautiful view of the Opera House from where we were staying. And it was just such a beautiful city. It was really fun. I got to go book shopping there. I got a wonderful bookshop recommendation from the channel A Fictional Escapist. And there I got the Terry Pratchett book, Equal Rights. And while my husband was recovering from the flu, we did go and enjoy a vegan gourmet restaurant called Yellow. The food was a bit more rich than what we're both comfortable or used to, but it was still fun. And we also enjoyed the opera scenes. So we got to go to the Sydney Opera House on the second night we were there and enjoy a recital of mad scenes. Mad scenes, if you don't know, is when the female protagonist in an opera is going through some sort of crazy mental breakdown, as you can imagine. Sometimes she is bloody, sometimes she's just loopy and going around stage all crazy. And so this has happened in quite a few different operas. And so I really enjoyed watching these mad scenes. They are usually an opportunity for the composer to show off his skills with coloratura, with crazy high notes and passages and amazing cadenzas. And if you don't know, I happen to be a big fan of mad scenes. I actually had done a couple of art pieces of mad scenes, of opera scenes before. So I have some artwork of that. And both scenes were performed in the recital, including the scene from Lucia di Lammermoor, which is probably the most famous mad scene of all time, as well as the mad scene from I Puritani. So it was really cool to see those come to life with the soprano Jessica Pratt. And I loved that this particular soprano, by the way, she sang as an encore Glitter and Be Gay. I got a kick out of the fact that it was a mad scene recital and she sang Glitter and Be Gay as the encore, because it's not what you would typically think of as a mad scene, but it is a mad scene. And the Sydney Opera House just celebrated its 50th anniversary and underwent some serious renovations. So the acoustics were amazing. You could hear everything perfectly, even from where we sat way at the back. It was absolutely incredible. Another highlight in Sydney was going whale watching. We took a boat out there, so it was another boat excursion to see whales. And I did try to catch a little bit of footage of this, but I didn't succeed very much because I found that when I was trying to catch it on film, I wasn't quite as in the moment as I wanted to be, so I gave up on that. But one of the biggest highlights was seeing 3 whales come out of the water and do the turn and flip up their fin. It was so magical. I loved it, but it was so cold. It was winter in Australia when we went, and we were fortunate because we heard that the weather was actually a lot calmer while we were there, that it was actually one of the more mild days in the winter. So we did enjoy some walking, some beautiful sights while there. But unfortunately, that day we went whale watching was the day that I ended up getting really sick with my husband's flu. And the next day I was out. I could not get out of bed. It was our last day in Sydney, so we canceled another hike. And I had no appetite. I had the worst headache. It was awful. And I ended up recovering pretty quickly. We both were just derailed for like a day with the flu, like maybe a day and a half. And then we had enough energy to enjoy our trip aside from that. But after that, unfortunately, I did get a cough and lost my voice. So it was a bit of a frustration, but I still enjoyed the trip overall. And when we left Sydney, we traveled via Singapore Airlines in the suites to go to Singapore. And so the Singapore Airlines suites, This we achieved through credit card points. My husband is just a genius when it comes to credit card points and travel. We are not rich. Otherwise, it would have costed like $7,000 because the suites gives you this sectioned off part of the plane. So you're there with your significant other or spouse, and you have this very comfortable chair that has various reclining positions, in addition to a bed that's alongside your spouse's bed, so you could sleep next to each other, and a TV monitor, of course, lots of space around you. The bathroom is amazing. It is so huge for an airplane. It was well lit with a vanity in it. It was very, very nice. And you get these gourmet meals, incredible service, a menu with the full array of coffees and teas, espresso drinks, alcoholic beverages. And unfortunately, I just couldn't enjoy any of it except for some tea and a few bites of food because I was still very sick. But the service was, like I said, incredible. It was such a luxurious experience that it was an 8-hour flight. And at the end, I was telling my husband that I have had 2-hour flights that have felt longer than that 8-hour one. It went by so quickly and it was so nice. And Singapore was absolutely amazing. I loved all of the tropical plant life, lots of birds of paradise and lotuses. It is called the Garden City, so the gardens there are spectacular. And this is juxtaposed by incredible architecture with amazing artistic design. So it was just beautiful to be there, just grandiose in so many ways. But it was just amazing as far as culture too. You had various districts like an Arab district, Chinatown, among other things. And we just had a wonderful time walking around the city, especially at night. At night, it was just gorgeous. By the way, the Singapore airport was amazing in and of itself. So we stayed there the first night, and it was so fun to just walk around that airport. I think it's supposed to be one of the nicest airports in the world, if not the nicest. I could be wrong about that. But we had a wonderful time staying there for the first night before moving on to the Andaz suites where we stayed and had a beautiful view of the city. Wonderful place. Singapore was just incredible. Leaving Singapore, we ended up on an 18-hour flight, or maybe what was just under an 18-hour flight on Singapore Airlines. Not the suites this time, just business class, but business class was still really nice. You still had that full drink menu and everything. It was tough though, because in order to try to minimize jet lag, we ended up trying to stay awake until New York time before going to sleep, and that was really hard. So I was running on very little sleep. I'm still jet lagged, honestly. But anyway, the book I read was East of Eden by John Steinbeck, and this particular book was a modern day retelling of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. And I would say this is a very sprawling story because we're following a lot of different characters at the beginning, and it takes a while before you see things start to focus in on specific characters and intersecting characters. I would say it showcases what it's like to be driven by the unconscious need or desire for love and not receive it, what happens as a consequence of that, whether it's a character going into full despair and sorrow, or whether it leads characters to make decisions that are destructive towards themselves and others, and whether that leads to a quest for power that's driven by envy and jealousy, which for some characters leads to guilt and shame. And underlying all of that is the unconscious fear that you are not good enough for the love that you desire. So I thought it was very interesting to see how that played out with several different characters. We are dealing with cycles of family. So there's a bit of a family saga going on here, a theme of inheritance, I would say, as well. And I thought that the Eve character in this story was quite the viper. She was so fascinating, as well as the Adam character, who was very tragic and heartbreaking. I just found the characters very detailed. They felt like they really came to life. Steinbeck has a way with words. He has a rhythm and flow to his prose. You'll be following characters for about 100 pages or more, and they'll suddenly die off page. But there was something about that that felt very honest to me. And it's also worth noting that this is not a plot driven read in the sense that we are building up to some big climax at the end. It's more connected through theme, through that Adam and Eve retelling, as I mentioned, and Cain and Abel retelling. So it's one that I would highly recommend if you enjoy that kind of sprawling narrative. And I'm really glad I got to this, as it was one of the standalones I wanted to get to in 2023. And that concludes my journey. That concludes my trip. And I thank you so much if you watched this entire video. I would love to hear from you. Have you read any of the books I've mentioned? Are you planning to read any of the books I've mentioned? Because I would love to know. And thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.